With the recent influx of woodland nature stories, I figured I'd finally share something that I've sort of been trying to forget for years. I've never told anyone about it, including the individuals involved, because I've always been a skeptic myself. And how can I expect somebody to believe my stories when I always hear theirs with a critical ear? Nonetheless, everyone on No Sleep seems receptive, and if anyone has had a similar experience or can help me explain what happened, I'd love to hear it. 2 days after graduating high school, my two best friends and I decided to take a camping trip on the mountain frequented by the locals. Although it's by no means in the middle of nowhere, the town it's in is a bit smaller and by no means a bustling metropolis. My friends, Brian and Greg, were 2 years older than me and had taken the trip to celebrate their graduation, and figured they'd introduce me to my college-age years by doing the same thing. We packed up all the necessities, tent, chairs, horrible light beer, the whole 9 yards. It was nearing dusk when we began hiking up to the camping area, which was about 4 or so miles from the base of the mountain. We set up camp and messed around, giddily exchanging drunken anecdotes while snacking on the burnt hot dogs that we attempted to cook on the outside fire pit, and eventually we passed out about 2 a.m. Not long after nodding off, a noise snapped me out of my sleep. I was still pretty intoxicated, but I couldn't make out what sounded like music coming from outside the tent. I assumed that it was Greg or Brian's phone going off and tried to ignore the sound rolling over. It was at this point that I realized I no longer had my blanket or pillow in the tent with me, and upon opening my eyes, I realized that this was not in fact the tent that we had set up at all, but just a tarp, which had been fashioned into a makeshift lean-to. My buzz was instantly replaced with full-blown panic attack as I broke into a cold sweat. I peered out of the lean-to and saw what the actual cause of the music was. A cassette player was sitting on the grass about 10 feet away from the tarp, and was playing what sounded like a homemade recording of a little girl singing that old church song, Go Tell on the Mountain. Accompanied by what I guessed was an offbeat xylophone. The only other defining feature about this campsite was a clothesline, one end affixed to a tree, another to the ground. There were 3 white dresses hanging from it, swaying slightly in the breeze. The whole thing was unsettling, to say the least. I was still trying to make sense out of what was going on when I heard walking in the forest about 50 yards away. I froze, not wanting to believe what I was experiencing, hoping that when I opened my eyes, I'd be back at the tent. No such luck. The rustling slowly got closer and closer, the tape abruptly clicked as it came to an end, and the rustling became what I sounded like a full-blown sprint. I tore off down the mountain, stumbling a few times and ripping open my knee on a gravelly trail. I didn't even realize it or feel the pain until the next day. I was so full of adrenaline. I don't know how I got back to the car at the base of the mountain, but when I did, I locked myself in the car and waited until morning. I guess I did manage to fall back asleep, because I was woken to Greg tapping on my driver's side window. He and Brian gave me some crap about how much of a wuss I was for not being able to stick it out the whole night on the mountain. I let them rag on me, because I figured it would be much easier than trying to explain the truth to them, and I didn't quite want to revisit it myself. It wasn't until a couple weeks later that I dared to ask the question that had been nagging me. I couldn't help but wonder how they figured out that I'd gone back to the car. I asked Brian when we were hanging out playing video games a couple nights later, and he told me that they'd got my note, and then just assumed that I'd gotten scared and went back to the car. I asked him what note he was referring to, as I definitely had no recollection of leaving one. He swore I did, and claimed that he still had it in his camping bag. After rummaging around a few minutes, he produced a scrap of paper that simply said, "Out walking." I slowly nodded and said that I guess I must have slept-wrote it. He laughed as he crumpled it and tossed it towards the garbage can. It's been 3 years since that night, and I can't explain the events of that camping trip. But I do know one thing. That note was not in my handwriting.
Never again can I bring myself to go into the woods. The events that transpired a few weeks ago caused this. Here's my story. I was never a big fan of rural areas, being born and raised into city life. But when my lifelong best friend Cody mentioned a big camping trip that he had been admittedly planning, I couldn't say no. Considering that he was my boss in the office and had given me the week off for the trip, there was no way I was getting out of it. Thoughts of sleeping in a tent surrounded by spiders and centipedes and God knows what else were enough to unnerve me. but after seeing his face light up like a little kid as he detailed his plans, I couldn't bring myself to let him down. He set us up on a 5-day hiking camping expedition through the woods a few miles outside of town. The woods intersected with our state's reservation for the Native Americans, and being 1/4 Mohawk himself, Cody genuinely wanted to check out some of the scenery that was included around the hiking area. Despite my initial hesitation, it did seem somewhat interesting, and I agreed to go with him on his little trip. Poor judgment on my part. A few weeks go by, and I find myself walking through the woods with Cody with 60 pounds of gear on my back, covered in sweat and mud, and wondering what the fuck I was doing. We had stumbled into the reservation early on the second day of our trip, and it was almost as if the woodland itself had a different aura to it. A pure feeling of some kind that we both noticed. But no matter how clean the nature felt around us, I was still disgusted by all the different insects and thorny plants that I continuously had to flick off from my clothing. After battling a horde of house cat-sized mosquitoes that was assaulting me, I asked Cody, "When are we gonna set up camp?" Not to be a bitch, but my legs are getting a little tired. He consulted his map and pointed over the next hill. "There's an old Mohawk burial ground over that ridge, and I thought it'd be cool to make camp there for the night," said Cody. Afraid to belittle his culture in some way, I reluctantly agreed. When we got to the burial grounds, it just appeared as about a dozen raised, stone and grass mounds in a small clearing. Nothing special to say the least. We pitched a tent in the tree line around the grounds, and unpacked some food. After eating dinner and discussing our company's upcoming financial merger, Cody grew tired and fell asleep. I powered up my phone and went to make my daily rounds of all the social networking sites. My last attachment to the city life that I had kept during our time in the woods. Under the large trees, I was getting no service, but as I walked towards the burial mounds, I was able to pick up a signal. As I was waiting for my emails to load up, the water I had with dinner started to catch up to me. Not wanting to urinate in open view of the tent, I dug around one of the mounds to relieve myself. Finally, my emails loaded, and I saw that absolutely nothing interesting had happened back home in the past 24 hours. Feeling satisfied I didn't miss anything, I started walking back to the tent to get some rest. When I reached the tent and went to undo the zippered door, I could feel the hair on the back of my neck perk up. That ominous feeling that something was watching me hit, and I was instantly aware of how loud my heartbeat had gotten. I turned my flashlight around slowly, and my beams caught a deer in the brush about 20 feet behind me. He was a pretty large buck, with a large set of antlers, and an ear that seemed to have been bitten off at some point. When I saw it was just a deer, my heartbeat returned to normal and relieved. I entered the tent to get some much-needed shut-eye. The next day we trudged onward through the reservation lands. As much as I hated the woods, I had to admit that the foliage was beautiful, and I'm sure any amateur photographer would have been kept busy in this setting. It wasn't until dusk that I noticed something was off. All the bird chirping and forest birds that we heard all day had completely disappeared. I assumed that the forest went to sleep as soon as the sun started to go down. Cody seemed a little uneasy about the sounds too. Regardless, we had set up camp, so we went to find firewood while I pitched the tent. Usually, it will take me 2 to 3 tries to get the tent set up correctly. That night was especially difficult because, once again, I had the eerie feeling I was being watched. I wheeled around and once again see the face of the deer with the broken antler and the damaged ear peering out of the bushes looking at me. Involuntary, shudders crept through my body, and I got the all-around sense that something wasn't right. When I made movements to try to shoo the deer away, he simply stayed put and stared at me with those beady black eyes. In this case, though, logic overcame my gut instinct, and I realized that the deer posed no serious risk to me, so I shrugged it off and continued setting the tent. When Cody returned with firewood, I told him about the encounter. His lower jaw dropped, and his face instantly put on a look of utter fear. He hurried me into the tent, closed the door, and started telling me a story about the Aquay, or deer men, that the Mohawks had legends about. They appeared as tall, dark, skinny men, yet could take the form of deer and other animals of the forest when need be. He described them as demons of the forest who preyed upon unwanted visitors and invaders to the Mohawk lands. He started explaining legends of how some of the original American colonists were gruesomely murdered after clearing Mohawk forests to make their homes in the New World. At this point, my hands were shaking uncontrollably, before Cody had to stop his story mid-sentence from a sudden fit of laughter. He looked at me and said, "Come on, man, I know you're afraid of the woods and all, but forest demons? Don't tell me you believe that shit." I punched his arm and called him an asshole and had no choice but to laugh at myself. Regardless, that night my dreams were plagued by shape-changing deer and wolves and bears who were waiting in the woods to murder me in some brutally violent way. These paranoid thoughts carried over to the next day's hike, where every sound that I heard was something stalking us, waiting for an easy chance to go in for the kill. Unfortunately for me, Cody didn't notice how much his story had thrown me off, and so I still had the task of collecting firewood that night as we set up camp. I took the flashlight and set up before it got too dark, as I was about 10 minutes away from our camp. My flashlight ran across a deer's face sticking out from the foliage about 30 feet ahead of me. Sure enough, he had a broken antler and a ruined ear. So it was the same one I had seen before. His beady, almost dead eyes just stared at me like they had the 2 nights before. Except this time, I noticed that something was really wrong with the whole picture. Then it hit me. The deer's head was almost 8 feet off the ground, and something was definitely fucking wrong. My hands started trembling as I panned the flashlight down from the deer's face, and between the leaves, I saw what looked to be a long, slender back arm with sharp claws pointing directly at me. I dropped the flashlight, turned, and sprinted towards the tent as fast as I'd ever run before in my entire life. Not looking behind me, I reached the camp and pushed Cody inside the tent. In my hysterics, I wasn't able to relay the full story to him, but he caught on to my fear immediately. We grabbed our camping knives and sat in the tent that night looking out the windows, vigilant for anything that would try to approach our camp. When dawn finally came, we were both still awake. By that point, he had gotten the full story, and after consulting a map, decided that we could make it to a local road and call for a ride back home before nightfall. Leaving all the non-essential items behind, we trekked for the road, called a cab, and got a ride back to the lot where our cars were parked. Cody still didn't entirely believe that what I witnessed was true, but I knew what I had seen. "Go home, get some rest, and we'll meet for drinks tomorrow," he said. "We can talk about it all then." I silently nodded my agreement as he dropped me off at my house and pulled off into the night. Feeling relieved to finally be back in the city, I jogged up the stairs to the door, unlocked it, and walked into the apartment. As I sat down my keys and walked to the bedroom for some well-needed rest, I noticed an odd irony tinge hanging out in the air. The smell was weak, but certainly there. I turned on the bedroom light, and it was just sitting there on my bed, staring back at me with its ruined ear and broken antler. The next day, the police told me that the deer had been skinned. Some sort of a mask had been made of its face and left in my bedroom. No additional evidence of a break-in was found. It was never determined how the perpetrators had gotten into my locked apartment. The police investigators tried passing it off as simply another random act of vandalism by some of the meth heads that frequented the area. According to the investigators, the weirdest part was that nothing was taken from the apartment at all. In fact, the only additional clues left behind were the 4 long gash marks that had been cut straight across my bed.